thank you all for coming. My name is Ravi Iyer. I am a data scientist for a company called Ranker, and we work in collaboration with a company called Zenzi Communications on exactly what you see here, using big data to reveal consumer values and inform storytelling. And I think this is appropriate at a conference like this. I was asked to say how this relates to future marketing. Increasingly, I think some of those of you who were in the last panel, the way we do things is increasingly about data. It's sort of the convergence of the way we do things and the things we say we care about. So increasingly, the things we say we care about are living a meaningful life, fulfilling our values, but we don't often merge the two. So that's what my talk is about. For those of you who don't know, Ranker is a consumer website, a top 400 website, I believe. About 8 million people a month come to the site and they rank things, list things, vote on things. So we collect about 2 million opinions each month. And so we have this graph of data, and Zenzi sort of provides this perspective of looking at that data from a values perspective and providing insights from that data to businesses that want to communicate better with their customers. So this is a little bit of an overview of our talk. My talk is organized almost exactly as it is spelled out in the program. First, I'm going to talk about big data, and I'm going to talk about so those of you in the last panel, we'll talk a little bit about what is big data and my particular perspective on big data. So again, I'm the principal data scientist at Ranker. I do a lot of algorithm design. I'm more technical than a marketer. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how we use data, how data can be used to reveal consumer values. My PhD is actually in psychology. So a lot of my background as far as using data is about is using it to measure psychological variables, and specifically moral psychological variables. So what do people care about? Why do they care about them? What people care about, how does that predict other variables of interest? And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about the piece that Zenzi brings to this, which is how we can use this data to actually inform marketing campaigns and storytelling. So I'm told, I'm not a marketer myself, I'm told that marketing campaigns these days are often about storytelling. So that's my talk overview. First, I'm going to give you a little bit of my perspective on big data. So I don't need to belabor this slide. Increasingly, everybody knows that people are talking about big data, that people use data to make decisions. Google might maybe personify the trend most, first and most of all. I guess what I want to convey with this slide is just how widespread it is. It's not just businesses using data. It's not just Google. It's not just Target. But it's also journalism, for example, is moving a lot more towards. So journalism on the whole is not necessarily a growth field. But if you do want to get a job in journalism, perhaps being a data journalist is a way to get into it more than being a traditional journalist. Sports is moving a lot more into the realm of, so the film Moneyball was a classic example. Now there's people working on basketball and soccer, things that are less quantifiable, trying to move them into the realm of data-driven decision making. So before we start, just give you a little bit of my perspective on what big data is. So a lot of people define big data in terms of this graph on the left here. It shows, you probably can't read it, but it shows 24 petabytes of data are generated, say, every day, for example. So a lot of people define data in terms of the size of the data, the number of observations that are made, the size of the data on the disk space. That's a very useful metric for those of us who are data scientists in some ways, because it takes very different techniques to work with data that is of a certain scale. So you have to do parallel processing. So there is sort of a formal definition of big data as far as data that requires more than one computer to process and utilize. But I think the size of the data is in some ways more relevant to engineers. For those of us who just want to answer questions using data, perhaps more important is is how much you can predict with the data. What can I actually do with the data? And so for that kind of question, I'd like to introduce another metric that I think is more useful, and that's connectivity. So how connected is your data? How many variables do you have in your data? And I think that's in some ways a better metric for the utility of big data. So when we talk about big data being ubiquitous and all the things we can do with big data, I'm going to argue, and I'm going to give you a few examples, how more connected data actually produces better results than just larger data sets that take up more space on your disk or that are of more people. So, if you are interested in sort of a deeper level of these arguments, There's a great paper on machine learning. I don't know how technical people want to get into it, but by Peter Domingos at University of Washington. It's actually a fairly readable paper about how, the details behind the things I'm going to say. And then more readable articles. The last issue of Wired had this great article on networks and how connected networks allow you to answer questions much better. So just a little bit to illustrate. So you often see graphs illustrating how much data is collected, how many people, the number of observations, the amount of disk space that's taken up. You don't often see graphs about how much more connected data is getting. So this is a graph of the semantic web. Semantic web just means data that's connected by strong identifiers. So for example, like our names are kind of weak identifiers. If I were to try to take our names and match them, say Visa has a list of names and Safeway has a list of names. You try to match them together. Sure, there's some probabilistic matching that goes on there, but is the guy Robert in one data set and Bob in another data set? There's a lot of names that overlap. So semantic data is data that has strong identifiers, a Wikipedia ID, a social security number, a zip code, things that are represented the same across data sets that can be used to connect data sets at a much more programmatic level. And increasingly, more and more data is being connected in this way that allows it to be matched together. So this is the connected, a graph of the semantic web in 2009. Towards the center of the diagram, there's DBpedia. Is one of those circles. DBpedia is data derived from Wikipedia. It's data derived from anyone who's ever edited a Wikipedia entry. A lot of those little boxes that you see on the side of Wikipedia's screens are scraped and put into an even more structured format. Just to the right of it is a company called Freebase. Those are probably the two best sources of semantic data. If you like connected data, if you end up liking connected data after this talk, then DBpedia and Freebase are great places to go. Freebase is, if anyone's done a Google search, you've interacted with Freebase's data, because Google bought the company that runs Freebase, MetaWeb, and integrated it into their knowledge graph. And so whenever you type something like Leonardo da Vinci or any proper noun into Google, you see all that data on the right side. That's all data from their knowledge graph. That's all data that's publicly available. It's all available to you if you wanted to mash it up into your applications. So this is the semantic web in 2009. And as you see, this is the semantic web. So I don't have a graph from 2013, but this is just in 2 years. Who knows what it looks like now? Maybe the reason I haven't found an updated graph is it got too big. But there's just so much more data that's being connected, and there's increasingly you hear about Facebook integrating with your shopping cart, programs and people connecting online to offline behavior. There's a lot more mashing up of data that's going on. In part, I think it's because that's where the value is being provided. Why do I think that that's where the value is being provided? Well, so at a broad level, so this is maybe a heresy to some data scientists who are really hard on algorithms. But honestly, at a certain level, algorithms all do the same thing. They all sort of have some measure of similarity between things, and they sort of use that measure of similarity to make predictions about the future. So if you have a data set that has strong similarities, you're going to get, whatever algorithm you use, you're going to get roughly similar answers. That's not to say there's no expertise in algorithm design, but a lot of the value, if you're going to spend money on things, is in getting better data into your algorithm, not on improving your algorithms. Another reason connectivity matters more than other metrics of big data is that if you have more of the same type of data, you're not actually able to predict more things. What you're able to do is get a more precise measure of your relationship. So say I'm using gender to predict travel preferences, right? And so I have 1,000 people, and I can predict 10% of the variance in travel preferences based on your gender. Okay, so if I got 1 million people, am I going to predict more than 10%? I'm not going to be able to predict more than 10%. What I get is a really precise measure of the relationship between gender and travel preferences. If I want to predict more variance in travel preferences, what I need is different variables, more data in my data set. And that's the kind of thing that connected data does. It gives you the ability to take the data you have and link it to the data that other people have, more variables, and then therefore predict more variance in the things that you care about. A good example of this is the Netflix prize. So some of you might have heard of the Netflix prize. They're trying to get a 10% reduction in the error. So on average, a Netflix rating, their prediction of your ratings for a new movie are about 1 star off. So if you think it's 3 stars, maybe they're at 2 stars, or maybe they're at 4 stars. So a 10% reduction in error would be about 0.1 star. So it's not a giant not a giant improvement. It's a big improvement for them because they have so many users that even a small increase in their user satisfaction is probably worth it. But in the grand scheme of things, it's not a huge increase in efficiency. And there are tons of teams who spent countless hours, some of the best minds in the country, working on algorithms for 3 years, and they just got that 10% reduction in error. So and there was no shortage of data. So there's no shortage of data, and there's no shortage of algorithms, and they barely got that 10%. So and then in the end, it was a great PR piece for Netflix, but none of the actual algorithms didn't actually make it into production because it was deemed too complex and not worth it enough, not worth the effort. Some parts of the algorithm did make it to production, but the entire algorithm ended up being this mash that wasn't deemed worth it. So connectivity matters because connectivity, one, reduces error. So again, when we return to the Netflix prize, the winning entries of the Netflix prize weren't any single master algorithm. It was a mashup of a bunch of different algorithms. At the end, the team, one team that had been doing well, and another team that was doing well, they merged together, and they saw that connecting their answers, the error across each of their individual techniques sort of canceled out somewhat, and therefore they produced a better answer by mashing up their algorithms. And then what you end up seeing was this mass rush to combine teams, and then you got kind of a photo finish to cross the 10% threshold. So it's the same principle behind meta-analyses in the sciences. Being able to connect answers across different data sets reduces your error. But the thing I want to talk more about that's probably more relevant to marketers here is that connectivity matters because it allows you to predict more variance for a longer period of time by providing depth to one's measurement. So, that's a long way of saying that connectivity, and I have a particular perspective, and that's in the title of the talk, which is it'll allow you to measure people's values, not just their sort of momentary individual desires or wants. So the other secret about sort of machine learning and algorithms is that so a lot of the work really goes into designing the variables that go into your algorithm. So I like this article, in part because my degree's in psychology, but also just because it illustrates that it's not all about the algorithms. It's about your insight into creating the right variables. So collecting the right data or looking at it from the right perspective, aggregating your variables into the right sort of uber variables. That's where you get the bang for your buck. So I'm going to argue that the right uber variables are variables about values. So second part of our talk, how can we use data to measure values? So first, just a broad, why do values matter? And so I think I can depending on the audience, I might talk about this slower or longer. My guess is that our marketing audience is well familiar with, well, I could be wrong. So this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so, briefly, things at the bottom are these sort of lower order needs, and the idea is as you satisfy these lower order needs, you can move up. And so there are various books that argue that we need to talk to people increasingly at higher levels. So as you satisfy your needs for safety and food and relationships, you can start thinking about fulfilling your values and self-actualizing. And increasingly, we're doing, at least for those of us with first world problems, we're doing a better job at satisfying these lower order needs, right? Obesity is probably a bigger problem for a lot of people who we're marketing to than, trying to find enough calories in the day. Crime is in some ways going down. There was a great article in The Economist recently about how, crime is generally on the decline. War is still a terrible thing, but in the last century, wars used to kill hundreds of thousands of people or millions of people. Now, wars kill tens of thousands of people. Still a terrible thing, but, nobody gets drafted. We fought 2 wars in the last decade. Nobody got drafted, right? Wars. The impact of wars is certainly far less, and there are fewer of them. So we're doing a better job satisfying these lower level needs, again, at least for the kinds of people many of us are marketing to. And so the kinds of things that people are caring about, they're freer to pursue these higher order needs. Just another way to graph it is just, as people's wealth per capita goes up, your gains are no longer, your gains in your lifestyle, or your gains in your well-being are no longer to be made through economic gains. They need to be made through lifestyle choices. And then you're increasingly seeing this in marketing programs too. So both governments and businesses are seeing this, are utilizing this trend. So for governments, you're seeing somewhat of a push to measure things other than gross national product. So if I were to go out to the parking lot and break into one of your cars, and then you went and got the car fixed, that would actually be an increase in gross national product, right? Because there's like economic activity going on. Is that actually increasing value in the world? Is that what we should be measuring? Probably not, right? So perhaps gross national happiness or our psychological well-being, measuring that directly, it would be a better metric for society. So as people are increasingly worried about satisfying their psychological needs, not their physical needs, you're also seeing marketers do this, right? So again, this is me, a data scientist, talking to a marketing audience, but I'm going to do this anyway. Just and so you see it, Coca-Cola, the last Volkswagen commercial for the Super Bowl didn't, it didn't mention, the miles per gallon. It didn't measure the amount of, the safety features of the car. It just measured that it makes you feel happy, right? You see this across companies, marketing to their own employees. Zappos' big company policies or their strategy is to make their employees as happy as possible. And if they make their employees as happy as possible, they'll make their customers as happy as possible, and they'll get that great customer service that keeps people coming back, right? The way they seek to do that, and this is based on research in psychology on happiness, is not, you can make them happy through rock star happiness, just sort of momentary highs. And that lasts a certain amount of time. You could also make them happier through engagement, so that kind of workaholic kind of happiness, the kind of happiness you get maybe from when you're running or when you're just sort of lost in what you're doing. That lasts a certain amount of time, but if you want to get a lasting feeling of happiness, so for those of you who are engaged in sort of happiness marketing, a lasting feeling of happiness also relates to values. Being part of something bigger than yourself, feeling like what you're doing is worthwhile. That tends to last longer. So you're increasingly seeing values more in the marketplace of ideas, and so Chip Heath and Jan Heath made a stick book. They talk about getting out of Maslow's basement, appealing to people's values. There are a few books here by companies who increasingly addressed their employees' values and saw increases in productivity. They thought it would be a cost to do this values-based program at work, and lo and behold, all their employees were much more productive and everything worked out much better and their company's more successful than ever. So you see that story over and over again. I threw in Rick Warren's The Purpose-Driven Life because the point I'm trying to get across here is that values doesn't just mean liberal values. So there's actually quite a diversity of values, and you often see these sort of values-based marketing campaigns trumpeted by companies that sort of lean in the liberal direction. But the Army's also been using values, and they're finding that when they talk about college loan forgiveness and skills gain, the motivation of the recruits doesn't last as long as when they talk about loyalty, duty, self-respect, honor. That gets you through those hard times in the military. So here is from psychology. I don't know how many people are familiar with this. This is Schwartz values scale, or Schwartz theory of values. It's one of the oldest theories in psychology as far as cluster analyzing values. It's been replicated cross-culturally, and it basically divides values into 10 dimensions. And you'll just see that, if you just look at it, it's not just doing good things for other people. So you have these values in the upper right that are kind of, altruism, how we traditionally think of as cause marketing. But values can encompass things like tradition, loyalty, things that we often associate more with religious or conservative groups. It can also encompass things that are sort of more libertarian leaning, things like seeking stimulation, seeking freedom. And then they can even include things that are kind of more selfish. So things like wanting success in life. And we need all kinds of people. We need the people who want to kill themselves to achieve things just as much as we need people who want to help other people achieve things, right? So there's a whole number of values that one can address, and a lot of the work we've been doing has been about using the data that we have to identify the specific values that people endorse, and then marketing and storytelling with that in mind. So we care about values. We have all this data. I've sort of made an argument about connectivity of data. Now I'm going to try and connect the two things. So, and the way I'm going to connect them is just, I don't think a lot of people have done. I think there are a few companies doing this, and we're one of them. But I think this is increasingly where marketing is going to go. Is that we're right now we're measuring these sort of more tangible things. We analyze click-through behavior. We analyze demographics, purchasing behavior, financial market outcomes, baseball outcomes. This is where data science is really developed. But the things we care about are these things on the right side, these intangible things. As an example of this is, the ad business. So probably, I'd say a large percentage of data scientists work in the ad business, trying to design, and everyone has their own sort of machine learning algorithm that's running against everybody else's machine learning algorithm, trying to optimize how much of that ad spend you get and other people don't get, to get the right ad in front of the consumer, to get a negligible but significant increase in click-through rates, right? It's a ton of data going into that. And what does it produce? Well, this is, yesterday I was surfing CNN, and so I actually had to buy a laptop because my laptop crapped out on me on the way here. And so, someone has probably targeted me. They've seen that I've surfed a few laptop websites, and they've done what they call retargeting, and they put an ad for a laptop on my article. So that's a reasonably good use of data, and that's what, following people across websites. But, in some ways, where would that fit in Maslow's hierarchy? It's kind of, I have a need and you're going to fulfill it, right? It's not like this long-lasting need. I bought my laptop. I don't need a laptop anymore. You can predict something for a specific period of time, but is that going to last? Is that a data point that's really going to allow you to have a deep relationship with a customer? I don't know. Even worse is like the ads or not the ads, but these are sort of recommended content at the bottom of a page. So a lot of machine learning algorithms also go into recommending other content on a page. And we work with this a lot at Ranker because we have a lot of content and we sort of try and surface related content. So I have some experience with trying to surface related content to people. And what you end up with in almost across all of these, this thing's on the left side. Where does this fit on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? If you put your data in sort of semi-raw format into an algorithm for recommending content, what you end up with is sort of the lowest common denominator recommendations. You end up with insights like men like clicking on things with attractive women, and people like clicking on things that are kind of sensational, or lists that sort of don't give away all the content ahead of time. So algorithm design is really, or variable design is really important. If you throw your variables into the data raw, or into your algorithms raw, you end up with these sort of more surfacey insights. So again, let me try and connect how you can actually use data to measure values and using connected data sets. So let's say I'm interested in how much someone values stimulation. So you might have a data set of, you might have Visa's data set or American Express's data set. You might be able to see people's purchasing behavior, and you might notice that they spend their money on experiences and not on material things, right? So that is one indicator that someone might value stimulation. But maybe they do that because they live in a small apartment. So maybe they can't fit enough things into their apartment, so they spend their money on dinners out. And so anything that's not related to the valuation of stimulation that goes into that measurement is what we would call error. So there's some amount of error in any measurement. But what if I don't just have Visa's data set that says what you spend your money on, but I also have your frequent flyer program data set, right? And I also have maybe some dining club rewards program data set. And I can put them all together. I have some common identifier. Well, so if I know that you spend your money on experiences, not goods, I also know that you travel a lot, I also know that you eat a lot of diverse restaurants. Well, the fact that you have a small apartment, that is error that's specific to spending your money on experiences, not goods. It doesn't necessarily affect, some of these other things as much. So each kind of measurement has its own kind of error. And when you aggregate across them, and when you use connected data sets that have different kinds of data and different kinds of error, you get a much more complete picture of a person. You get a much more precise way to measure things that are really hard to measure, that are somewhat more intangible. So the error can cancel out, and then you start to see that you value stimulation. So if you can start using, I think we're not using the data as well as we could as far as using the connectivity of the data to see a 360-degree view of a person. A lot of times we're just using the data, and if you ever, I don't know how many people work with those behavioral targeting firms and look at the buckets that exist, but the buckets that exist are fairly low level. I'm an in-market auto buyer for a Honda Accord. These are the kinds of things that we can target to, not things like, this person values these broad things. So let me just tell you a little bit about how Ranker helps solve this problem. So we think of ourselves as a data company. If you go to our site, we have lists of all sorts of things. We think of ourselves as sort of Yelp for everything else. So people make lists of their favorite movies. Yelp does this for restaurants. TripAdvisor does this for hotels. There's a whole domain of things that needs answers to the question of what is the best X or Y. So what's the best politicians, celebrities, newspapers, books, TV shows. The funniest thing that happened at the Oscars last night, the most obnoxious person who I saw, I don't know, on this TV show, all sorts of, we have a really long tail assortment of lists. And then what people do is they vote on these lists, and so effectively, and we sort of gamify it, so we in turn collect about 2 million votes each month from various people. Because we ingest, so the way we create these lists is we ingest data from that graph that I showed you before, from DBpedia, Freebase. We turn it into lists, people make these opinions, and that creates this layer, this opinion layer. So when you get data from DBpedia and Freebase, it'll come out unordered. So if you want a list of people who went to a certain school and have a certain profession, well, you can do that with DBpedia and Freebase, but it won't tell you who's the most famous person and who's the least famous person, or who's the best doctor or the worst doctor who went to Harvard, for example. You need people to help order that information. That's sort of what we provide. And then when you cluster analyze this data, so this is one list that we have, role models we'd like to meet in person. And so this is a cluster analysis of one list. And what you find is that not just in this case, but across cases, you often find clusters that actually look like value orientations. So you probably can't read this, but on the left here is Martin Luther King, William Shakespeare, John F. Kennedy. So that you have like a few liberal people, a few sort of, and you have some scientific figures, Bill Gates, Stephen Hawking, Warren Buffett, and actually Barack Obama's in that left cluster. And then over on the right, you have more religious, historical figures, like you actually have Moses, the Virgin Mary, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, Winston Churchill. So you can sort of infer, it clusters in a way that you can infer a value type. And this is not just in the domain of people, but here's data from Hunch's website, in the domain of food, and so we find the same sorts of clusters. If you do it in TV and entertainment, those cluster really well as far as the kinds of stories that people consume, clustering along with different value types. And I'll show you some data on that in a second. So when you start analyzing data in a graph and look at it in a more holistic way, and look for clusters, you'll often find clusters that are indicative of things that are higher up in Maslow's order of needs, and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And if that's what we actually care about, then that's the kind of cluster analysis and leveraging of connected data that we should be ideally striving for. Even when you look at it at a product level, you can start to see these clusters of interest. So for example, we're just cluster analyzing the Nissan 370Z, and the people who appreciate that sports car also tend to like the TV show Breaking Bad, Arrested Development, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. What do these things have in common? They all have kind of these anti-heroes, anti-authoritarian figures. So, the last part, how do we use this data to inform storytelling? So again, these are things that probably a data audience would know less than a marketing audience, but one of the things that Zenzi has taught me is that communication is often about storytelling. And that's actually something, in psychology we talk about as well, that narratives are kind of natural to human beings. Obviously we've been doing it for millions of years. You don't see dogs watching, so concerned about what other dogs are doing as much as you see people so concerned about what other people are doing, spending many hours a day watching other people on a TV. The classic psychology studies are about, inferring a story from like circles and triangles running around on a screen. And so that was supposed to illustrate how we just naturally construct narratives. But I think that a more modern case that I think is more illustrative to me is, when the Boston Marathon bombing hit, all the people who were trying to look at all the pictures, and so these are quotes from an episode of This American Life, where they were talking about the people who were trying to analyze these pictures and try and find, who was a bomber and who wasn't a bomber, and a lot of that story was about how hard it was not to read stories and how easy it is to make false positives, because you just look at a picture like this and you can't help but think like, he's got his hand up to his mouth, maybe he's like nervous, right? You start taking these small things that aren't necessarily related and relating them and turning them into a story. And so Ira Glass said, it's just so hard to look at these pictures without imposing a story on it. You can't help but read a story into it. So that's kind of what we're doing with Zenzi and Ranker, is like taking data on people's values and trying to predict and trying to leverage social media. So we have values domains that are roughly analogous to the Schwartz value scale, leveraging leveraging the years of research that have gone into it. We've sort of simplified it into six domains instead of 10 domains that are sort of more predictive in a consumer psychology context. But they still highly correlate with the Schwartz values domain. So, and what we do is we take data from social media. So we take data from Ranker, some other websites that we have access to, some more research-based websites, people's Facebook likes, all the social media that sources that you guys are familiar with. We put them together and we use that to make predictions about what either a company's current customer base or a company's potential customer base, what values would resonate with them. And then we use that because values predict a wide variety of things. We can use that to predict the things that matter to these businesses. So some of the things that values predict. So I intimated a little bit of this earlier. Values predict the kinds of things that you buy. So this distinction between material goods and experiences. So some people buy experiences like dinners out, vacations, versus physical things. And people who value stimulation buy more experiences. People who don't value stimulation tend not to buy material goods. In contrast, people who value power do tend to buy more material goods and tend to buy less experiences. Now, how can you use that if you have a specific product? Well, actually, a lot of products actually fall in between there somewhere. So you can think of your iPhone. You can think of your iPhone as something, I have the latest and greatest iPhone, and something I want to compare to other people. So that's thinking of it in a more material way. That social comparison aspect is a big part of material consumption. Versus thinking of something in an experiential way, which would be thinking about savoring it, thinking about how you would feel using it. So you can position your product and you can market your product in a more experiential or material way, and you might do that differently if you knew the values of your customers, right? Or the target values of your customers. If you're marketing to someone who values power, maybe you want to market that it's the latest and greatest and the best technologically advanced model. If you're marketing to someone who values stimulation, maybe you should talk more about, all the apps that are available or the feeling of the iPhone in your hand, something like that. Values predict where you want to live. So people who tend to prioritize safety or live in communities that are safer tend to value conformity or tend to value tradition. And they tend not to live in communities that have a lot of technology. People who value stimulation, they don't seem to value safety as much. And they do live in places that tend to have high tech, lots of technology, tech startups. So how can you use this? A lot of us have databases of zip codes, for example. And we have existing, and zip codes are easy to map onto other semantic web data sources. You can easily find the crime rates of your, you can find the crime rates, you can find percentage of people who voted for McCain versus Obama in 2008. You can find all sorts of values markers and zip codes. You can merge them into your data set, and you can start to make predictions about people's values and start to make your marketing campaigns more predictive or more targeted from a values-based perspective. So again, also from a geographic standpoint, so we did this around the Super Bowl. Fans of the San Francisco 49ers prefer feta cheese, Rocky Road, and Cosmopolitan, that's the drink. Fans of the Baltimore Ravens tend to prefer coffee, bell pepper, ham, so these are affinities. And so what this data is effectively people on the Ranker website voting for their favorite foods and people voting on their favorite sports teams, right? It's the correlation between those two things. So one, it sort of reinforces that geographic segmentation, but also two, just like I showed you with Hunch, values predicts the kinds of things that you want to eat, and in probably even a broader level, the kinds of things you want to eat tend to cluster along dimensions that are indicative of these sort of value-oriented variables. So you can sort of infer that someone who likes feta cheese, Rocky Road, the drink the Cosmopolitan, they're kind of seeking out stimulation. They're seeking out new experiences. Someone who says, what are my favorite foods? Coffee, ham. That's probably someone who's maybe is a little bit more of a security seeker, seeking something safe, something they know that they like, right? And so then as far as tying it to storytelling, values relate to the kinds of stories that people read and consume and also the kinds of stories that they appreciate. So people who value hedonism, they tend to like stories where people question authority. So think about like the Harry Potter novels, for example. People who value tradition don't like stories where people question authority. And they actually do like stories which have happy endings. So that should, there's very obvious predictions as far as how one should be communicating with these people based on, these differing values. Here's another dimension of storytelling. So here we have identification versus escape. So identification is, do I tell stories to people about people who are similar to them, or do I have stories about people who are sort of far removed and allow them to escape from their everyday lives? Now, you can like both. You can like stories about people who are similar to you and stories about people who are very different than you. But there is some, if you're designing a campaign, you might have to choose between one or the other. So it might be useful to know which value types prefer the people who are more like them and which value types prefer people who are different than them. And what you find is that, for example, people who value universalism tend to prefer stories about escape or about people who are very different than their everyday lives. People who value power and in contrast or security, they tend to prefer stories about people who are like them. So again, sort of very relatively actionable, A/B testable insights that one can put into one's marketing campaigns. And so what we're finding is that, in keeping with research on storytelling, so this is just some research just showing that narrative ads do work, and we see that, so Ranker's based in LA, and I go to some occasional startup things, and it seems like the biggest thing in so a lot of ad-based startups in LA, and the biggest thing in that world is the idea of native ads that don't seem like ads, that flow within the context of the user experience. So narrative ads work, and apparently it seems to be a settled idea. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that ads that actually take into account, narratives that actually take into account the specific values of your consumer work better. So this is just a case that we did with a company called Toe Socks. So they make those socks that fit your toes individually. And so one of the things we did is we surveyed them. We found that their customers tended to be purpose seekers. They tended to be people who sought, universalists, people who appreciated doing things for other people. So we A/B tested sort of a typical campaign for them and a more cause-based campaign. So a typical campaign might just have more utilitarian information. A cause-based campaign was, how their Toe Socks was helping the ASPCA and helping the dog population. And there's not that big a difference in the open rates, and you might not be able to tell the difference in the click-through rates as the orange bars. But the difference is between about 5.5% to 8.9%. So it's about a 47% increase in click-through rates, through a value-based email message. So that's more or less the things I wanted to get through in my talk. So just to recap, I just, for those of you who are just interested in big data generally, I just love you to think maybe when people talk about big data, not just about the size of the data set, the number of observations and the amount of disk space that it takes, but think about the connectivity of the data set, the number of variables in the data set. These are the things that really, as a data scientist, I can tell you that really do drive prediction more than, so number of variables, better variables, and more diverse variables will drive prediction, not size of your data set, sample size, right? And you can use that, you can use connectivity to measure intangible things like consumer values, especially when you have these data sources from all these different diverse perspectives. That in some ways is how psychologists define personality traits. A personality trait is something that lasts from situation to situation to situation. So you need diverse data sets in order to understand, they act this way in this situation and in that situation and at this time and at that time point. You get enough of those things together, you get an understanding of the kind of person a person is, and not just an understanding of their behavior at one point in time. And we can get beyond marketing to people because they happen to visit a website at one time and start marketing to people because they broadly exhibit these behaviors across situations and across times based on their values. And lastly, how you can use these values to inform storytelling. So when you know people's values, there are very specific stories, kinds of stories, actors and stories that people appreciate based on their values and that other people don't appreciate. And you can, think about the movie and TV preferences that you have and that other people have and why they differ. And if you start to think in those lines, you probably will see that there's something about what you value in life. Do you like love stories? Do you like action stories? Do you hate conflict? Do you love conflict? There's something in there that's indicative of the kind of person you are at a deeper level. Okay, so I'm going to end with You know, we are looking for beta testers if anyone's interested. I have flyers. You know, we can help you analyze your current customers, do value surveys of your customer base, also identify new customer bases you might want to target that might have similar values, develop new communication strategies based on these personas, and A/B your values messaging.